What is going on, everyone? This is Eric coming at you from just outside Hartford, Connecticut. And today we have one of the oldest trades that we're going to be discussing in our trade breakdown series, as this is the Mike Lowell trade, which occurred February 1st, 1999. A whole century ago, kind of. But this trade, the original trade at least, is between the Miami Marlins, at the time the Florida Marlins. I went over this in a previous video. I'm just going to call them Miami, it's just easier. And the New York Yankees. So, without further ado, we will jump right into this. And, of course, the Miami Marlins would receive third baseman Mike Lowell from the Yankees in exchange for a trio of pitchers in Ed Yarnall, Todd Noel, and Mark Johnson. How did this work out for the two teams? Well, if you followed baseball into about 2012, 2013, you know one of these four names, so you know who won this trade. And we'll start off with Miami. Obviously, looking at WAR, you can see Miami had a pretty good WAR win here. They got Mike Lowell, obviously. And he played like an elite third baseman at times during his 7-year tenure in Florida. He was a 3-time All-Star. He was actually a 1-time World Series champ as the team did win the World Series. And he was a 1-time Gold Glover, 1-time Silver Slugger Award winner. And he was just very good at times. There were a couple times where he just wasn't that hot, but he also, shortly after being traded to the Marlins, it was found that he had cancer. So he had to beat cancer before he even took the field for the Marlins. Goes to show you. And he ends up getting traded after the 2005 season. And he goes to the Boston Red Sox alongside starting pitcher Josh Beckett and relief pitcher Guerrero Mota in exchange for 4 players in shortstop Hanley Ramirez, starting pitcher Anibal Sanchez, pitcher Harvey Garcia, and reliever Jesus Delgado. So, of course, we'll stick with Miami here. And Hanley Ramirez, he had a very impressive 7-year stint as the Marlins shortstop. He was a 3-time All-Star, just like Lowell was. He won Rookie of the Year. He was a 2-time Silver Slugger. And he did win the NL batting champ. So he was the NL batting champ, I should say. So he had the highest average in the NL one year. And he did pretty good, but he ends up getting traded to the LA Dodgers. And that is in a previous video that just came out, so definitely check that one out if you're curious about the Hanley Ramirez trade to the LA Dodgers. But he did very well in Miami. Anibal Sanchez, he started off pretty well by throwing a no-hitter in his rookie season, but then injuries really started to kick in, and they limited him a lot over the next few seasons. And he was a good starter on some pretty bad teams for a little while before he gets traded to the Detroit Tigers, alongside second baseman Omar Infante, in exchange for pitcher Jacob Turner, catcher Rob Brantley, and reliever Brian Flynn. Now, if you know the name Jacob Turner, we have discussed him before. He was actually one of the players drafted prior to Mike Trout in the 2009 MLB draft. He had a decent 2 years in Miami before he himself ends up getting traded to the Chicago Cubs for a pair of pitching prospects in Tyler Bremer and Jose Arias, and both Bremer and Arias never made the big leagues. Pretty easy part of that trade right there. Back to this one. Brantley, he started off decent, but really entered into a bad slump, and injuries really limited him in his second season. He ends up getting waived. And the last one in this part of the trade was Brian Flynn, and he struggled over his few appearances before he himself ends up getting traded up here alongside a pitching prospect named Reed Redmond to the Kansas City Royals in exchange for a reliever Aaron Crow, who, if you recognize his name, was also drafted before Mike Trout in the 2009 MLB draft. Just had to point that out there. And Crow, he didn't even play for Miami. He just doesn't play, and he ends up leaving as a free agent. Now back to this trade here. So Harvey Garcia, he played in a handful of games before he himself ends up getting cut, didn't do all that much. And Jesus Delgado never made it to the big leagues. So all in all, Miami got a decent haul. Specifically, Hanley Ramirez really helped him out. And it goes to show you, if they would have held on to if they would have been able to pair Hanley and Lowell, who knows what would have happened. Now we get to the Yankees, of course. And the Yankees, how did their 3 pitchers that they acquired work out? Well, not that great. So Ed Yarnell here, the top one, he was decent for one season. He wasn't great at all. He had a couple rough starts that hurt him more, but he was decent over one season before he gets traded. And he's traded to the Cincinnati Reds alongside pitcher Brian Rich, outfielder Jackson Melian, and third baseman Drew Henson, in exchange for pitcher Denny Neagle, and outfielder Mike Frank. So Denny Neagle, he underachieved in one season in New York because he was pretty much the big name in this trade before he ends up walking as a free agent. And Mike Frank never played for the Yankees in the majors. He was a minor leaguer for them. He played in the majors before. He played in the majors after, I'm pretty sure, but he didn't play for the Yankees. As for the other two here, Todd Noel, he never made it to the big leagues. And Mark Johnson ends up getting picked in the Rule 5 draft, and he never makes it to the big leagues for the Yankees. Now, how did the other teams involved in this trade do? We'll start with the Red Sox, of course. They're the ones who got Mike Lowell. So Lowell had 2 strong seasons to start off his tenure in Boston before injuries really started to kick in and slow him down. He was decent, but he wasn't elite. He was pretty dang good at the start, though, of his tenure. So Josh Beckett, he was actually one of the better starting pitchers for 6.5 seasons, well in Boston. He did very well. And then we end up seeing that infamous chicken and beer scandal. They were eating chicken and drinking beer. So that's kind of one of the things that ended up leading Beckett to getting traded. But he was a 3-time All-Star while in Boston. And Guerrero Mota, as I mentioned in a previous video, Mota was traded shortly after this trade to the Cleveland team in a package for Coco Crisp. He did not play for Boston in the big leagues. How did Detroit do? Well, Detroit, Anibal Sanchez, he had a solid 5.5-year tenure. He started off strong, but he ends up struggling at the end of it, and he gets demoted from starting to a bullpen role. Well, Omar Infante, he had a solid season and a half before he also walked. He was an older player, so the Chicago Cubs, Jacob Turner, he struggled over 8 games, and then he himself winds up getting released. With Kansas City, Brian Flynn, he was okay in parts of 5 seasons, but he just kept bouncing between the minors and the majors. Well, Redmond never made it to the big leagues, and of course, last but not least, we have Cincinnati here. And you can see 3 of them didn't even make much of an impact. Yarnell never made it, never played in the majors for the Reds. Melian here never made it to the big leagues at all. And Reach here, actually, he played 3 seasons for the Reds, and he struggled to make a name for himself, so he ends up leaving. And I saved Drew Henson for last. Now, Drew Henson, he spends 1 year in the minors for Cincinnati before he ends up getting traded back to the Yankees. And if you recognize the name Drew Henson, it's not as a baseball player. So Henson ends up retiring from baseball and going into football, and he made his name known as a backup quarterback for a little while for the Detroit Lions. So just a very interesting thing. A lot of these guys can be dual sport athletes, and Drew Henson was one of them. He made his name known in baseball enough, but he never made it to the majors, and then he ends up going to football. So that's the Mike Lowell trade. Obviously, the winner of this trade is going to be the Miami, Florida Marlins, mostly because Lowell did very well. Hanley Ramirez and Anibal Sanchez were very good players. Other than that, it's a bunch of okay mix-ins that didn't do much. And the New York Yankees only got a .4 WAR out of this trade, and most of that's because of Denny Neagle, who they got in a secondary trade. So they really kind of just gave up on Mike Lowell way too early. Boston had a very good showing here, getting a 32.9, but you got to realize, too, Lowell and Beckett were kind of salary dump moves by the Marlins at that point. So they knew they were giving up good players. Detroit got an 11.6 out of their 2 players. The Chicago Cubs got a negative .6. The Cincinnati Reds did worse with a negative 1.4 WAR, and the Kansas City Royals got a decent, respectable 1.7 WAR, especially getting, a 1.7 WAR out of a guy who never played for the Marlins. So, all in all, interesting trade. It's always cool to look back at these old trades, especially ones from the 1990s. You don't really get to do that too much. But hope you guys enjoyed this video. Again, this was the Mike Lowell trade. Have a great rest of your day.